They laughed when Sarah fell in the mud. They cheered when the dogs pulled against their chains. They thought they were watching a slave girl run for her life. But before sunrise, 27 people would be gone, because the path Sarah ran was not a race, it was a map. If you're listening from a place where freedom still means something, comment your city, your state, or your country below. And as you watch Sarah take her first step into that forest, ask yourself one question. Would you have seen a frightened girl running? Or would you have seen the map she was leaving behind? The first thing they did was make sure everyone could see her. Sarah was brought out just before sundown, when the heat still sat low over Blackthorn Plantation, and the guests had already begun drinking under the white canvas tents. The men stood with polished boots in the grass. The women watched from shaded chairs, their gloves clean, their faces still, their voices low. They had come for supper, music, and spectacle. Elias Whitmore had promised them something unusual, not a horse race, not a card game, not another speech about cotton, land, and the price of labor. He promised them a girl who knew the woods too well. Sarah stood near the edge of the clearing with her hands bound in front of her. She was young, no older than 22, though the plantation had already taken years from her face. Her dress was torn at the hem. Mud had dried around her ankles from the morning work. One side of her mouth was swollen, not enough to alarm the guests, just enough to remind everyone what kind of place this was. Elias liked details like that. He liked punishment to appear controlled, civilized, almost administrative. He stood in front of his guests with one hand resting on the head of his cane. Behind him, 2 overseers held the dogs back by thick leather leads. The animals were not released yet. They were displayed first, like evidence. Their barking cut through the music and forced the crowd to look toward the tree line. That was the point. Elias did not simply want Sarah punished. He wanted her reduced in public. For weeks, he had believed she was involved in escapes from Blackthorn. 3 people had vanished after nightfall, and no one had seen them leave. No horse was missing. No wagon track was found. No broken gate had been discovered on the main road. The men sent after them returned angry and empty-handed. Elias did not need proof to suspect Sarah. On plantations like Blackthorn, suspicion was often treated as evidence. A whisper could become a sentence. A glance could become guilt. And Sarah had made the mistake of seeing too much. She knew which fence posts leaned after heavy rain. She knew where the creek thinned in summer. She knew when the North Patrol grew lazy. She knew which storage shed had a back door that no longer closed. She knew the plantation not as property, but as terrain. That made Elias afraid of her. Not afraid in the honest way a man fears danger. Afraid in the way a cruel man fears intelligence in someone he has tried to own. So he created the race. He told the guests it was a lesson. Sarah would run from the clearing, through the burned pine marker, across the dry creek bed, past the abandoned storage shed, over the ridge by the old grave, and toward the northern fence before being dragged back. If she slowed, the dogs would be brought closer. If she collapsed, she would be carried. If she screamed, the crowd would hear it. He said this was what happened to those who thought they knew the land better than their master. The guests laughed because they understood the message. They were not there to watch sport. They were there to watch ownership perform itself. But Sarah was not looking at Elias. Her eyes moved past him. To the kitchen yard, to the laundry line, to the stable wall, to the woodpile, to the shadowed row of cabins beyond the smokehouse. 27 people had arranged themselves across the plantation under the cover of ordinary work. A woman stirring a pot, a boy carrying split wood, 2 men repairing a wagon wheel that did not need repairing, an old man sitting with his hand around a walking stick. A young mother standing near the wash basin, one arm held carefully across her stomach. They were not gathered together. That would have been dangerous. They were scattered like accidents, but every one of them was watching Sarah. Near the kitchen steps, Aunt Ruth stood with a bucket in her hand. To the guests, she looked harmless, old, slow, half-bent from years of labor. The kind of woman men like Elias stopped noticing because they had already decided she was no longer a threat. That was one of their many errors. Aunt Ruth had been counting patrol steps for months. She knew which overseer drank before midnight. She knew which dogs were fed too heavily after public events. She knew which guests would keep Elias occupied long after supper. And more importantly, she understood what Sarah was about to do. Earlier that morning, while the others pretended not to hear the preparations for the race, Aunt Ruth had passed Sarah by the washing trough. Neither woman looked at the other for long. Aunt Ruth whispered, "They'll all be watching." Sarah answered, "Good." There was no more time than that. No prayer spoken out loud, no dramatic farewell, no promise that either of them would live through the night. Only a plan too dangerous to write down. That was the central fact of Blackthorn. Nothing could be written, nothing could be carried, nothing could be found in a pocket, under a floorboard, inside a Bible, or sewn into a hem. A map would be death, a list of names would be death. A drawn line toward the north would be death. So Sarah would make the map with her body. Every turn, every fall, every pause, every mark of blood and mud would mean something. The burned tree would mean left. The dry creek would mean hide the tracks. The abandoned shed would mean gather. The old grave would mean wait for the weak. The northern fence would mean the third rail. And if the dogs were brought close, Sarah would turn into the wind. That was not panic. That was instruction. Elias did not know this. His guests did not know this. The overseers did not know this. That ignorance would become the only mercy Blackthorn ever gave. A man in a gray coat stepped closer to Sarah and examined her like livestock before an auction. He asked Elias if she was the one who had caused all the trouble. Elias smiled. "She knows the woods," he said. "Today she learns the woods belong to me." Sarah heard him. She did not answer. That silence irritated him more than begging would have. He wanted fear displayed clearly. He wanted trembling. He wanted the guests to see that his authority could enter a person's body and break it. Instead, Sarah kept looking toward the tree line. One of the overseers cut the rope from her wrists, not because they trusted her, but because the performance required movement. Her hands dropped to her sides. The skin underneath the rope was rubbed raw. The dogs surged forward. The crowd shifted. Someone laughed nervously. Elias raised his cane and the plantation quieted around him. For a moment, everything was still enough that Sarah could hear the ordinary sounds beneath the cruelty. A bucket set down near the kitchen, a wagon wheel turning once, a child coughing behind a cabin wall, Aunt Ruth's shoes scraping lightly against the dirt. Those were her witnesses, not the guests, not Elias, not the men with the dogs. The witnesses were the people who needed to survive the night. Elias turned toward the assembled crowd and lifted his voice. "Let her run," he said. "Let everyone see what happens to a girl who thinks she knows the woods better than her master." No one corrected him. No one in that white tent objected to the premise. That was the machinery of the place. Violence did not require madness there. It required permission. It required spectators. It required people clean enough to pretend they had not participated. Sarah bent slightly, not like a runner preparing for sport, but like someone listening to the ground. Across the yard, Jonah watched from behind a stack of firewood. He was 13, thin, frightened, and trying not to blink. Aunt Ruth had told him he must remember the order exactly. Burned tree, creek, shed, grave, fence, third rail. He repeated it inside his head until the words stopped feeling like words and became a path. Burned tree, creek, shed, grave, fence. Third rail. Sarah looked once toward him, only once. Then Elias gave the signal. The gunshot cracked through the clearing. The guests flinched. The dogs erupted. And Sarah ran. She did not run toward freedom, not yet. That part would come later for others. She ran toward the burned tree first, fast enough to seem desperate, uneven enough to look afraid. Mud struck the back of her dress. The overseers shouted behind her. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for the first fall. Sarah gave it to them. At the burned pine, she stumbled hard and struck the blackened bark with her left hand. Her knees hit the dirt. The guests reacted exactly as Elias wanted. They laughed. But from the kitchen yard, Aunt Ruth saw the hand on the tree. From the woodpile, Jonah saw the direction of the fall. From the stable wall, 2 men saw her body turn left before she rose again. The first mark had been given. Sarah pushed herself up and kept running. Behind her, Elias smiled, believing the lesson had begun. He was right. But it was not his lesson. The crowd believed the fall had meaning only because it hurt. That was how Blackthorn taught people to see. Pain was treated as proof. If Sarah went down, they called it weakness. If she got up, they called it stubbornness. No one under the white tent asked why her hand had struck the burned tree before her body turned left. They did not have to understand her to enjoy what was being done. Sarah moved downhill from the pine, not straight into the open trail Elias had marked with flags, but along the broken edge of it. It looked careless. It looked like fear pulling her off course. An overseer shouted for her to stay inside the line. Elias lifted one hand, amused, and told him to let her run. That order would matter later. It meant there were witnesses. It meant no one could claim Sarah had been guided by anyone else. Every strange turn, every pause, every change of direction happened in plain sight, under permission from the man who thought he controlled the game. Sarah entered the dry creek bed with one hand pressed against her ribs. The creek had not carried real water for weeks. Only a thin strip of damp clay remained under the shaded banks. She slowed there, dragging one foot briefly through the mud before stepping onto the stone shelf beneath the roots. The guests booed. They wanted speed. They wanted panic. They wanted a chase clean enough to understand. Sarah gave them confusion instead. She kept to the stones for several yards, then stepped down again where the clay darkened. A visible print appeared, then disappeared where she climbed back onto rock. To men watching from a distance, it looked like exhaustion. To Jonah, hidden behind the woodpile, it was the second instruction. Do not stay on open dirt. Use the creek. Break the track. He repeated it silently, his mouth barely moving. Burn tree, left, creek, stones. Break the track. Aunt Ruth saw him from across the yard and gave no sign of approval. Approval was dangerous. Even a look could be harvested by suspicious men and turned into punishment, so she kept her face dull. She stirred a pot that was already cooked and watched Sarah through the smoke. The young mother near the wash basin, Liza, watched too. Her hands rested low against her body. She had worked through the morning, though her child was due any day. Elias had not noticed. Pregnant women were useful until they stopped being useful, and then the plantation treated their pain as an interruption to production. Liza knew she was one of the 27. She also knew there might soon be 28. Sarah had argued for her place in the escape. Aunt Ruth had resisted at first, not because she wanted Liza left behind, but because the route was hard and the risk was severe. Liza had ended the argument with one sentence: "If I stay, my child is born into his book." No one spoke after that. There were some truths so plain they did not need discussion. Sarah reached the bend where the creek passed behind the abandoned storage shed. It had once held tools, salt barrels, and broken harnesses. Now its roof sagged, and one rear board had come loose from the frame. The plantation had stopped using it because the newer storehouse stood closer to the main yard. Neglect had made it useful. Sarah stumbled toward it and grabbed the door frame, breathing hard. One overseer laughed and called out that she was looking for a place to hide. The guests answered with more laughter. Elias watched carefully but still saw only the surface. His mind had been trained by ownership to underestimate anything not done for him. Sarah turned her head once sharply toward the rear corner of the shed. Jonah saw it. 2 men by the wagon wheels saw it. Aunt Ruth saw it. Gather here, not at the cabins, not at the fence, not under the trees where the dogs would be brought first. The shed would be the meeting point because it was useless to the plantation and therefore invisible to the men who ran it. That was another fact Elias never understood. The enslaved survived by studying what power ignored: a loose hinge, a drunk guard, a rotten rail, a forgotten shed, a woman no one listened to, a girl no one believed capable of strategy. These were not small things. They were openings. Sarah pushed away from the shed and ran toward the rise beyond the creek. By then, sweat had darkened her dress. The dogs strained again, and one of the handlers asked if he should release them closer. Elias waited. He had promised danger, not an ending. Dead property made poor spectacle. Injured property made a better warning. "Bring them up," he said. The handlers moved forward. The dogs surged, pulling hard enough to drag one man several steps. Their noise changed the air. Even the guests stopped laughing for a moment. Fear entered the clearing, and this time it was not staged. It moved through the enslaved workers like a cold hand. Sarah heard the chains behind her. She did not look back. Looking back would teach nothing. She ran up the ridge where the wind crossed from west to east. Earlier in the day, Aunt Ruth had tested it with ash from the cook fire. The ash had blown sideways toward the tobacco field. That meant the scent trail could be weakened if the escape line crossed the ridge at the right angle. Sarah reached the top and changed direction into the wind. The movement looked frantic. It was not. One of the dogs lost the clean line and veered toward the creek. The handler cursed. The crowd cheered anyway, unable to tell the difference between pursuit and failure. Jonah saw the turn. Aunt Ruth saw the dog falter. This was not theory now. It worked. For a brief second, the plan became more than hope. It became evidence. Sarah continued toward the old grave on the Pine Hill. Most people on Blackthorn avoided that place, not because they respected the dead, but because the hill was uneven and the ground there had never been properly cleared. A few stones leaned beneath the pines, their markings weathered down. No names were readable from the clearing. No flowers grew there unless someone risked placing them in secret. Sarah slowed as she passed the largest stone. Her left hand lowered, brushing the top of it. The gesture was brief, too brief for Elias to question, too deliberate for Aunt Ruth to miss. Aunt Ruth's face changed for less than a second. Then it closed again. That grave had not been chosen only because it stood on the route. Sarah knew it for another reason. Years earlier, her mother Miriam had vanished after a failed escape. The official story on Blackthorn was simple. Miriam had betrayed others, led them wrong, and died for it somewhere off the northern trail. Official stories on plantations were rarely records of truth. They were instruments of control. Sarah had never accepted the story. Aunt Ruth had never confirmed it. But on certain nights when the cabins were quiet and the patrol had passed, Sarah had seen Ruth leave a small stone near the Pine Hill. Not often, only enough to keep memory alive. Now Sarah touched the grave in front of everyone. It was both landmark and accusation. The dead were still part of the route. The ridge dropped sharply after the grave. Sarah came down too fast and nearly fell, catching herself against a low branch. The guests shouted. One woman turned her face away, then looked again when she realized no blood had shown from the distance. That was the moral measure of the gathering. They could look at suffering as long as it stayed entertaining. Elias stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. His smile had thinned. Sarah had run farther than he expected, not successfully, not gracefully, but with a stubborn pattern that began to irritate him. He could not name what troubled him. He only knew the performance was no longer obeying the shape he had imagined. "Cut her off at the fence," he told one overseer. The man nodded and moved toward the northern line. That, too, became useful. The watchers saw which guard left his place. They saw how long it took him to reach the fence. They saw that the west side of the yard remained uncovered while everyone's attention shifted north. Aunt Ruth stored it away. The escape would not happen by courage alone. Courage was not enough against horses, dogs, guns, and men who believed the law had been written for their convenience. The escape required timing, distraction, knowledge, discipline. It required 27 people to move as one body without ever appearing to gather. Sarah's race was giving them the last missing pieces. She reached the northern fence at an angle. It was taller than the others, built to separate the plantation's inner grounds from the wooded edge that led toward marshland. Most of it was sound. One section was not. Rain had softened the bottom posts. The third rail near the split oak had begun to rot from the inside, still whole to the eye but weak under pressure. Sarah knew because she had tested it 2 weeks before while carrying feed buckets. She ran directly into it. The impact drove the breath from her. Her shoulder hit first, then her forearm. She gripped the third rail as if trying to hold herself upright. Her fingers tightened around the wood. When she pulled away, a dark smear remained where her skin had torn against the rough grain. The guests made a sound that was almost satisfaction. Elias raised his cane again, signaling the end. The handlers pulled the dogs back before they reached her. An overseer grabbed Sarah by the arm and turned her toward the clearing. She did not resist. Resistance at that moment would have served only Elias. She had already done what she came to do. Across the yard, Jonah stared at the fence. Third rail, blood mark, split oak. He repeated it until it burned into him. The 27 had their map now. Not on paper, not in ink, not in any form Elias could seize, burn, or display as evidence. It lived in their bodies, passed from Sarah's movement into their memory. The overseer dragged her back through the clearing. Mud streaked her dress. Her breathing was uneven. Her face showed pain but not defeat. Elias approached her slowly, making sure the guests watched. "You see," he said loudly, "the woods do not save anyone." Sarah lifted her eyes to him. For the first time since the race began, she spoke. "No," she said, only one word, quiet. Controlled, nearly swallowed by the dogs and the crowd. Elias leaned closer, irritated. "What was that?" Sarah said nothing more. She did not need to. Aunt Ruth had already turned away from the pot. Jonah had already lowered his eyes. The young mother had already stepped back from the wash basin. The men by the wagon had already stopped pretending to repair the wheel. The race was over. The lesson had been delivered, and Elias, surrounded by witnesses, applause, and his own arrogance, still did not know he had just allowed 27 people to learn the way out. They took Sarah from the clearing before the guests finished laughing. That was how Elias preserved the illusion of order. The spectacle ended when he decided it ended. The injured girl was removed. The dogs were pulled back. The musicians began again after a short silence. Plates were filled. Glasses were raised. Men who had watched cruelty from a safe distance resumed speaking of weather, crop yield, and money. Violence did not interrupt the party. It was part of it. Sarah was dragged past the stables and shut inside a narrow holding room used for stolen tools, sick field hands, and anyone Elias wanted hidden until morning. There was no bed. Only a low bench, a bucket, and a window too small for a body to pass through. The door locked from the outside with a heavy iron latch. The overseer shoved her in and told her to be grateful she was still breathing. Sarah landed against the wall and stayed there until his footsteps left. Only then did she move. Not much, just enough to sit upright. Her shoulder had taken the fence hard. Her knees burned from the fall at the tree. Her palms were open in places where bark and rail had torn skin. None of it mattered in the way Elias believed it mattered. Pain was not the story. Time was. She turned her head toward the small window. From there she could see a section of the yard between the stable and the smokehouse. Lanterns moved in the distance. Voices rose from the party. The dogs had quieted. That was important. Dogs that barked all evening were often fed heavily afterward to calm them. Aunt Ruth had counted on it. Sarah listened. A fiddle, laughter, a chair scraping. A man calling for more whiskey. Blackthorn was entering the hour when arrogance became careless. Inside the kitchen, Aunt Ruth worked with her head down. She served food she had cooked and did not eat. She poured coffee for women who did not look at her face. She carried plates past men discussing the race as if they had witnessed clever entertainment instead of calculated humiliation. One guest said Sarah had spirit. Another said Elias had been too generous. A third joked that the girl might dream of running all night. Aunt Ruth kept walking. The discipline of survival was often mistaken for submission. That mistake had protected her for years. At the rear table she placed a tray down beside Liza and spoke without moving her lips enough to be noticed. After the third song. Liza did not answer. Her hand tightened around a folded cloth. That was all. No meeting, no speech, no final blessing. A plan that large had to move through almost nothing. A glance, a pause, a bucket placed in the wrong corner, a lamp left unlit, a shoe tied twice. The 27 knew their roles because they had been rehearsing ordinary behavior for weeks. One man would leave first, not toward the woods, but toward the privy. 2 women would follow 10 minutes later carrying laundry. The old man with the limp would pretend to cough until someone told him to go lie down. Jonah would carry ashes to the pit and not return by the same path. Liza would wait until the kitchen emptied, then move with Aunt Ruth behind the smokehouse. The danger was not only being seen, it was being seen together. Plantation power survived by counting bodies. In the field, at the bell, in the quarters, at ration time, at punishment, at birth. At sale, counting was control. The escape had to break the count before anyone noticed the numbers no longer added up. From the holding room, Sarah heard the third song begin. It was a bright tune played badly by men already drunk. She closed her eyes. The first shadow crossed behind the smokehouse. Then another, then none for a while. That was good. Too many at once would expose everything. Jonah left the woodpile with a bucket of ashes. He walked slowly, because a boy hurrying at night could be questioned. His legs wanted to run. He forced them not to. At the ash pit, he turned his body so the stable lantern would not catch his face, then slipped behind the old tool shed. He found Samuel there, the man with the wagon wheel, waiting in the dark. "Say it," Samuel whispered. Jonah swallowed. "Burned tree. Left, creek stones, shed, grave, fence." "Third rail." Samuel nodded once. Again. Jonah repeated it, not because Samuel had forgotten, but because fear could break memory. The words had to survive panic. At the far edge of the yard, Aunt Ruth moved last. That had always been her decision. If someone was missing, she would know. If someone panicked, she would hear it. If a child cried, she would decide whether to stop or keep moving. Leadership in such a night did not look like command. It looked like taking responsibility for the cost. She found Liza behind the smokehouse, bent over, breathing through pain. "Can you walk?" Ruth asked. Liza nodded too quickly. Ruth looked at her once and knew the truth. The child was closer than they had hoped, maybe hours, maybe less. But hope had never been a reliable instrument at Blackthorn. They had to move with the facts they had. Ruth took her arm. "Quiet steps," she said. Liza answered, "I know." The first gathering point was the abandoned shed Sarah had marked. One by one they reached it, not all from the same direction. not at the same pace. A cluster would have been fatal. Instead, they appeared like pieces of night separating from darker night. By the time Aunt Ruth arrived, 24 were present, then 25. Then 26. She counted again, 26. Her face did not change, but the silence around her tightened. "Jonah," Samuel whispered. The boy was not there. No one moved, no one cursed, no one spoke his name again. Sound carried strangely at night, and terror made people careless. Aunt Ruth looked toward the quarters, then toward the creek line. Jonah knew the route. Without him, they could still move, but the weakest among them depended on his memory. He had watched Sarah closer than anyone. He had seen the blood mark on the rail. He knew where the creek stones began and where the mud would take a footprint. Samuel leaned close. "We go." Aunt Ruth did not answer at once. Every second spent waiting was a second given to Elias. Every second spent leaving was a judgment against a child. That was the arithmetic slavery forced on people and then blamed them for making. A shape moved near the shed wall. Jonah came out of the dark with both hands held against his chest. For one breath, Ruth thought he was wounded. Then the cloth moved. A small sound came from inside it. Liza stepped forward and stopped as if struck. Jonah's voice shook. She was crying in the cabin. No one asked whose child. They knew. Liza had given birth alone before the planned hour, or close enough to it, that the newborn had been hidden by the women in the quarters. The child had not been counted, not yet placed in Elias's ledger, not yet reduced to a number in the inventory that gave men like him the confidence to call theft what was actually rescue. Jonah had gone back for her. It was reckless. It was necessary. Aunt Ruth looked at the infant, then at the faces around her. There are moments in history where survival and humanity appear to stand against each other. That is the lie cruelty creates. It makes people believe they must abandon the vulnerable in order to defeat the powerful. Aunt Ruth refused the terms. "No one born tonight belongs to him," she said. Liza took the child, and the group moved. They did not run. Running made noise and broke lines. They walked low through the grass, single file first, then split into pairs near the burned tree. The tree was black against the darker woods. Sarah's handprint could not be seen at night, but the shape of the trunk was enough. Jonah touched the bark once. Left. They turned. Behind them, the party continued. That was the obscenity of it. While people crossed the first threshold of escape, Elias Whitmore was still entertaining guests on land maintained by their labor and fear. His safety depended on the belief that suffering made people too broken to organize. That belief was now failing him in real time. The group reached the creek bed. Samuel stepped down first and tested the clay, too soft in the center. He pointed to the stones along the shaded side. They moved as Sarah had shown them, 1 foot on rock, 1 on root, no open dirt unless there was no choice. The old man with the limp nearly slipped. Jonah caught his elbow. Liza held the newborn tight against her body, pressing cloth near the baby's mouth without smothering her sound. Aunt Ruth stayed near the back, erasing what little disturbance she could, with a branch. There was no heroism in the clean sense. There was labor, careful, frightened, disciplined labor. At the bend, they left the creek and reached the storage shed from the rear. The loose board came away exactly as expected. Inside, hidden beneath rotted burlap and broken barrel hoops, were 2 water gourds, a strip of dried cornmeal bread, and a small knife wrapped in cloth. No one celebrated. Supplies meant only that the next hour was possible. Ruth handed the knife to Samuel. "Only for wood," she said. He understood. The route continued toward the ridge, but the sound reached them before they climbed. A dog barked once from the direction of the stables. Everyone froze. One bark could mean nothing, a dream. A chain pulled in sleep, a handler passing too close. Then another dog answered. The newborn stirred against Liza's chest. Jonah looked at Aunt Ruth. The plan had always allowed for pursuit, but plans made before midnight often looked different when the dogs woke. Ruth raised one hand. No one moved. From somewhere beyond the trees came the faint sound of a man laughing at the party. Then a door slammed near the stable. Then the dogs fell silent again. Aunt Ruth lowered her hand. They climbed the ridge. At the top, the wind struck their faces. Sarah had been right. Ruth felt it and turned the group into it, just as Sarah had done with the dogs behind her. Not because they were safe, but because the body of one injured girl had already tested the condition for them. The old grave waited ahead beneath the pines. This time, they would not pass it as spectators. They would pass it as people carrying the map forward. The grave on the pine hill had no name left on it. Rain had taken the letters first, then moss, then years of deliberate neglect. Blackthorn kept ledgers for cotton, tools, livestock, debts, and bodies, but it did not keep honest memory for the dead. That absence was not accidental. A person without a grave could be turned into a rumor. A mother without a name could be used as a warning. Sarah had understood that before the race. Aunt Ruth understood it now. She stopped the group just below the ridge and raised one hand. 27 people lowered themselves into the dark grass without argument. Their breathing was controlled but uneven. Liza held the newborn against her chest. Jonah crouched near the old man with the limp, one hand still ready to catch him if he slipped. The grave stood a few yards ahead between two pines. Samuel looked at Ruth, waiting for the next order. She did not speak immediately. This was the place where speed and memory collided. The plan required movement. The dead required acknowledgement. Ruth knew the cost of both. She stepped forward and placed 2 fingers on the top of the stone. "Miriam," she said. The name moved through the group without being repeated. Not everyone had known it. Some were too young. Some had arrived at Blackthorn after the story had been rewritten by Elias and his men. They had heard only fragments: a woman who led people wrong, a woman who broke under fear, a woman whose mistake got others caught. That was the official version. It had always been useful to Elias. If he could turn Miriam into a cautionary tale, he could turn courage itself into danger. He could make people fear the guide more than the master. That was one of slavery's quiet instruments. Not only chains, not only threats, but the poisoning of trust between the oppressed. Aunt Ruth looked toward the woods beyond the grave. "She did not betray anybody," she said. No one asked how she knew. They were past the hour for questions that had waited years. Ruth gave them the facts, short and hard. Miriam had found the route first. Burned pine, creek bed, storage shed, Pine Hill. Northern fence, Marsh Road. She had tried to take 9 people through it years earlier, but the third rail had not been weak then, and one man had panicked before they reached the fence. The dogs had been brought out too early. Miriam turned back to draw the pursuit away from the others. The plantation called that betrayal, because truth would have made her dangerous even after death. Sarah had grown up hearing the lie. Ruth had let her hear it because a child who openly defended a condemned mother would be watched. That silence had been one more cruelty required for survival. Jonah looked back the way they had come. The sounds from the plantation were changing. The music had stopped. Not completely. A fiddle still scraped somewhere near the house, but the rhythm had broken. Men were moving now, too many feet, a door opening. A voice raised, then cut off. Aunt Ruth heard it too. The time for the dead was over. "Move," she said. They crossed the hill in pairs, stepping where Sarah had run hours earlier. The grave passed behind them, but it did not disappear. It had entered the route fully now. Not as superstition, not as sentiment, as evidence. Sarah's map had not begun with Sarah. It had been inherited from a woman the plantation tried to erase. That made the escape larger than one night. It made it a correction. They descended toward the northern fence. The trees thinned there, and moonlight showed the line of rails ahead. Beyond it lay the wooded edge leading to marshland, then a road no one at Blackthorn used unless they were hunting, hiding, or leaving. Samuel went first with the small knife from the shed. He did not cut. The blade was too weak for that, and cutting made sound. He used it to pry mud from the base of the rail and test the rot Sarah had marked. Third rail. Split oak. Blood mark. Jonah found it before Samuel did. The smear was dark now, almost black in the moonlight, but the shape of Sarah's hand remained on the wood. He reached toward it and stopped before touching it. Aunt Ruth saw the hesitation. "Remember it," she said. "Don't worship it." That was the discipline she carried. Even symbols had to serve survival. Samuel pressed his shoulder under the third rail and lifted. The wood resisted at first. The old man with the limp moved beside him, surprising everyone, and added his weight. Another man joined, then another. The rail gave a low crack. Everyone froze. No shout followed from the plantation. Samuel breathed once and worked the rail loose from the post. It came free with a soft tearing sound as rotten fibers split inside the wood. The opening was narrow. Too narrow for panic, wide enough for order. Children first, then Liza with the newborn, then the old man. Then the others. Aunt Ruth stayed at the plantation side of the fence until the count was nearly complete. 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. She looked for Jonah. He was still inside the fence, staring back toward Blackthorn. "Boy," Ruth said. He did not move. At first she thought fear had taken him. Then she followed his eyes. In the distance, through the trees and darkness, a lantern had appeared near the stable. Then another. The holding room. Sarah. Jonah whispered, "She's still there." Ruth's face hardened. That had always been true. That had always been part of the plan. Sarah stayed because if she disappeared with them, the alarm would be instant and exact. Elias would know the race had been the route. He would put dogs on the marked path before the group reached the creek. Her body in that locked room was not failure, it was delay. But Jonah was 13. He had watched Sarah run, bleed, and teach them. A mind can know a sacrifice and still revolt against leaving it behind. Ruth stepped close to him. "She bought us time," she said. "Don't waste what she paid." It was the hardest sentence she had spoken that night. Jonah looked at her and something in him changed. Not healed, not accepted, changed. He climbed through the fence. Ruth followed last. Samuel pulled the rail back into place as best he could. It would not hold under inspection, but from a distance the fence line looked unbroken. That was enough for minutes. Minutes mattered now more than mercy. They entered the woods beyond Blackthorn. Behind them, the plantation began waking in pieces. A cook noticed an empty pallet. A stable hand found a bucket dropped where it should not have been. An overseer cursed because 2 men assigned to the wagon yard were gone. The first count failed. Then the second. Counting, the instrument of control, turned against its owners. It did not confirm order. It exposed absence. Inside the main house, Elias Whitmore was still at the dining table when the first overseer entered. The man's face had lost color. He did not speak in front of the guests until Elias demanded it. "How many?" Elias asked. The overseer hesitated. That hesitation did more than words. It told the room the damage was not small. "How many?" Elias repeated. "More than 20. The room changed. The guests who had laughed earlier now looked at one another with the private alarm of people suddenly implicated in incompetence. The same spectacle that had entertained them would soon become an embarrassment. For men like them, embarrassment often provoked more urgency than cruelty itself. Elias stood slowly, not because he was calm, because rage, in men used to command, often began as stillness. "Sarah," he said, No one had mentioned her. He did. That was instinct. His mind went at once to the girl he had tried to break in public. Even before he understood the method, he understood the threat had a name. He crossed the yard with 2 overseers and a lantern. The dogs were awake now, pulling at their leads, confused by too many overlapping scents: food, mud, alcohol, horses, sweat, blood, and the night movement of 27 people who had not left by the expected road. At the holding room, Elias seized the latch himself. He expected emptiness, he expected proof, he expected to find the door forced or the window broken. Something simple, something that allowed him to call her escape the beginning of the crime. The door opened. Sarah was inside. She sat on the low bench, shoulders bent from pain, hands resting in her lap. Her dress was still marked with mud from the race. Her face was pale under the lantern light. She looked at Elias without surprise. For a moment, no one spoke. The overseers checked the window, still barred. The latch. Still whole, the walls, no opening, no tunnel, no trick that their minds could accept. Elias stared at her. If she was there, then she had not led them physically. If she had not led them physically, then the route had been passed another way. His face tightened as the first piece of understanding touched him. Not enough yet. Only enough to frighten him. "Where are they?" he asked. Sarah said nothing. An overseer stepped forward, but Elias raised his hand. He wanted the answer himself. He wanted to restore the shape of power in the room. "You think this is clever?" he said. "You think they'll get far?" Sarah's breathing was shallow. Every inhale cost her. Still, when she spoke, the words came out steady. "You should hurry." It was not a plea. It was not defiance in the loud sense. It was information delivered too late to help him. Elias moved closer. How did they know the way? Sarah looked past him through the open door toward the yard where the party lanterns still burned, and the guests were now standing in uneasy clusters. The answer was everywhere, in the mud, in the creek bed, at the shed, on the grave. On the third rail, in the memory of 27 people who had been forced to watch her humiliation and had used that command against the man who gave it. Elias did not yet have the whole truth, but Sarah saw the moment coming. Outside, the dogs began pulling toward the wrong road. The first search went exactly where Elias expected it to go. That was why it failed. Men with lanterns moved toward the main road, toward the wagon track, toward the shallow crossing where runaways had been caught before. They shouted to one another as if volume could replace judgment. They dragged the dogs across ground crowded with old scents and fresh confusion. Horses stamped in the stable yard. Guests stood back under the tents, suddenly quiet, unwilling to leave but no longer entertained. The plantation had changed shape in less than an hour. What had been a theater became a crime scene, but the crime, as Elias understood it, was not the one committed by him. It was never the stolen labor, the locked rooms, the public humiliation, or the children counted before they could speak. In his language, the crime was absence. People he claimed as property had removed themselves from his reach. That was the only violation he could name. Inside the holding room, Sarah watched him discover the limits of that language. He stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand. His face showed fury first, then calculation, then something closer to alarm. The overseers waited behind him, eager for an order because orders were easier than thought. Outside, a dog pulled hard toward the yard, then lost the scent near the stable. Another turned toward the kitchen. A third barked at the place where food scraps had been dumped after the party. The handlers cursed. Too many people had crossed the yard that evening. Too much food had fallen. Too much liquor had spilled. Too many polished boots had trampled over the signs. The party itself had damaged the trail. Elias had invited witnesses to his power, and they had helped erase the evidence he needed. That was the first consequence. Sarah saw it before he did. Elias turned from the open door and shouted for the dogs to be taken to the quarters. He believed fear would have sent the fugitives there first, or that some fool had hidden beneath floorboards. Men rushed toward the cabins and threw doors open. Blankets were ripped aside. Straw mattresses were overturned. Children who had not been part of the escape were pulled awake and questioned by lantern light. Nothing. Only empty spaces where 27 people should have been. Those absences were more damning than any confession. A pallet still warm. A work shirt left hanging on a peg. A bowl of unfinished cornmeal beside a cold hearth. A pair of small shoes missing from the doorway. Elias moved through the quarters himself, counting with his eyes, needing the number to become smaller. It did not. Each room confirmed the next. The plantation had not lost one person in panic. It had lost a group under discipline that frightened him more than distance. A single runaway could be explained as desperation. 27 meant organization. 27 meant communication. 27 meant that beneath his bells, keys, dogs, and overseers, another system had been operating without his permission. The men around him understood pieces of it, but not the whole. One overseer said they must have had a map. Elias turned so sharply, the man stopped speaking. A map would have been something they could imagine, something hidden, something physical, something punishable, something that could be searched for and found. But they had already searched trunks, bedding, toolboxes, loose floorboards, and hearthstones for years. Blackthorn was built on searches. Its owners knew how to look for paper. They did not know how to search memory. Elias walked back toward the holding room. Sarah had not moved. He entered this time and closed the door behind him. The lantern placed between them made both faces harder. "You told them," he said. Sarah's eyes did not leave him. "When?" She remained silent. "Where?" Nothing. His questions exposed him. He still imagined the plan as a whispered meeting, a secret conversation, a hidden message passed from hand to hand. He could not yet admit the answer because the answer would make him ridiculous. She had told them while he watched. She had told them while his guests clapped. She had told them with the race he ordered, the path he selected, the crowd he arranged, and the humiliation he believed belonged to him. Elias stepped closer. "You think silence protects them?" Sarah's breathing changed, but her face did not. Pain was working through her now. The body, unlike courage, has limits. The race had taken more from her than the men outside understood. Her shoulder had begun to stiffen. Her palms throbbed. One knee was swollen beneath the torn fabric. Still, her mind stayed on the route. By now, if Aunt Ruth kept the count and Jonah held the order, they would be past the fence. They would be moving through the first stand of pine beyond Blackthorn land. If the wind held, the dogs would struggle. If the baby stayed quiet, they might reach the marsh road before dawn. That was what mattered. Elias leaned down, lowering his voice. "Where are they?" Sarah looked toward the wall as if listening to something beyond it. Then she said, "You watched." The room seemed to tighten around the words. Not shouted, not dramatic, not pleading, just the truth, placed cleanly in front of him. At first Elias did not understand. Then his eyes changed. The burned tree, the creek bed, the shed, the grave, the fence, the third rail. Each image returned to him not as entertainment now, but as evidence. Sarah falling against the blackened pine, Sarah stepping through the dry creek, Sarah gripping the shed door, Sarah touching the old stone, Sarah crashing into the northern fence. His own memory began to accuse him. Outside, the plantation was still moving in confusion. Inside, Elias stood very still. "You used my race," he said. Sarah did not answer. She did not have to. That was the second consequence. The humiliation had reversed direction. The spectacle designed to prove his control had become proof of his blindness. Every guest had witnessed the escape route. Every overseer had allowed it. Every laugh had covered instruction. Every cheer had helped disguise method. Elias opened the door and shouted for the men to check the fence. The search changed at once. Lanterns swung north. Boots struck the yard. The dogs were dragged away from the cabins and toward the line Sarah had marked. By then, valuable time had been lost. The plantation's first mistake had been arrogance. Its second was delay. Its third would be anger. Anger made the men move fast, but not carefully. At the northern fence, they found the third rail pushed back into place. From a distance, it appeared intact. Up close, the truth showed. Rotten fibers exposed. Mud disturbed. A dark smear where Sarah's hand had marked the woods hours before. One overseer cursed and looked back toward the house. Another asked why no one had noticed it earlier. No one answered because the answer condemned them all. They had noticed. They had seen Sarah strike the fence. They had laughed. The dogs took scent beyond the rail, but weakly. The wind broke the line across the ridge. The creek had already confused the earlier track. The party had spoiled the yard. The fugitives had not fled like frightened individuals. They had moved like people who had been taught where to step. That was the third consequence. Pursuit was now behind the truth, not ahead of it. Beyond the fence, Aunt Ruth heard the first organized shouts rise from Blackthorn. She did not turn. The group had entered marsh-edge ground, where the soil changed from firm pine needles to wet root and black mud. This was the hardest stretch. The old man's limp worsened. Liza's strength was fading. The newborn remained alive and dangerously quiet, pressed against her mother beneath Ruth's shawl. Jonah walked near the front now. He no longer repeated the landmarks. They were behind him. Ahead lay the part Sarah had not been able to run in daylight. The marsh road Miriam had found years before. Ruth knew it. Samuel knew part of it. The rest depended on judgment. A cry rose far behind them. The dogs had reached the fence. Samuel stopped. Ruth did not. "Keep moving," she said. "They're on it," he answered. "They are behind it." That distinction was everything. The group moved deeper into the marsh line. Water gathered around their shoes. Branches cut against sleeves. In open dirt, they would have been easy to follow. Here the ground swallowed marks and made every step costly for pursuer and fugitive alike. A child began to shake from cold. An older woman took off her own outer cloth and wrapped it around him without slowing. No one thanked her, not because gratitude was absent, but because there was no breath to spare. The road appeared near a dead cypress, narrow and pale in the dark, not a real road by plantation standards. No carriage would use it. No guest would see it. It was a line made by hunters, water, and people who needed not to be found. Miriam had used it once. Sarah had preserved it. Ruth now led them onto it. Behind them, the dogs barked harder, then broke apart into uncertain noise. The scent had split near the wet ground. The handlers argued. Elias arrived at the fence too late to hear the first confusion, but early enough to see the men failing. That enraged him. He demanded speed. He demanded the dogs be pushed into the marsh. He demanded riders circle east. Orders came easily to him. Results did not. He looked toward the dark beyond the broken rail and finally understood the scale of what Sarah had done. She had not merely pointed toward a gap. She had used his entire plantation against him. The guests, the race path, the dogs, the neglected structures, the bad fence, the wind, the hours of drinking, the arrogance of men who confused ownership with intelligence. He returned to the holding room before dawn. Sarah was still seated on the bench. The sounds outside had grown worse. Men were riding out. Women from the party were being moved back into carriages. Someone had started crying near the kitchen, and someone else had been ordered silent. Blackthorn's polished mask had cracked. Elias entered with mud on his boots. For the first time that night, he looked less like a host than a man standing amid ruins he had helped build but never understood. "They won't make it," he said. Sarah looked at him. He needed her to believe that. He needed the sentence to repair something in himself. But the truth had already moved beyond the fence. By then, 27 people and one newborn were on the marsh road, heading toward the first gray line of morning. Sarah said nothing. Her silence was not empty. It was distance. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came first as a pale line over the marsh road, then as a gray wash through the trees, then as a hard exposure of faces that had been moving through darkness for hours. Mud had reached their knees. Pine needles clung to torn hems. One man carried a child whose feet could no longer hold. Liza walked with the newborn tied close under Aunt Ruth's shawl, her face drained but fixed forward. No one mistook daylight for safety. Daylight made them visible. Behind them, Blackthorn had not stopped moving. Riders had gone east. Dogs had been forced through wet ground. Men who had laughed the night before now shouted into woods they did not understand. But the fugitives had gained what Sarah bought with her body: distance, confusion, and time. Time was not freedom, but without it, freedom had no chance. Aunt Ruth stopped them near the dead cypress where the marsh road split. One path bent toward a trader's road. The other sank deeper into low ground where water covered the roots and the air smelled of rot. Samuel looked toward the firmer path. "That one is faster," he said. Ruth shook her head. "Faster for horses, too." That ended the argument. They took the low ground. The old man with the limp almost fell at the first crossing. Jonah moved under his arm without being told. Hours earlier, Jonah had been a frightened boy repeating landmarks to keep from forgetting. Now he carried part of another man's weight and said nothing about it. That was one of the first signs that Sarah's map had done more than point the way. It had changed the people following it. They were no longer scattered workers pretending not to know one another. They had become a moving body with one purpose. The plantation had tried to make each person survive alone. The escape required the opposite. A child slipped. A woman pulled him up. Liza weakened. Ruth slowed the line. Samuel heard riders far behind and sent 2 men ahead to test the flooded bend. No one asked who was in charge. The answer kept proving itself through action. At mid-morning, the baby began to cry. The sound was small, but in that open wetland, it seemed large enough to condemn them. Everyone stopped. Liza pressed the child close, terrified of the noise and terrified of stopping it too harshly. No one blamed her. The child had entered the world during flight, before a name could be spoken safely, before a fire could be lit, before a mother could rest. This was what Elias would never understand. To him, the newborn would have been an addition to inventory. A future hand, a future price, a future line in a book. To the people around Liza, the child was evidence against the entire system. She had been born outside the count. That made her dangerous. Aunt Ruth stepped to Liza and took a small piece of cloth from her sleeve. Inside was a pinch of sugar stolen from the kitchen stores, saved not for comfort but for emergency. She touched it to the child's mouth. The crying weakened, then stopped. The line moved again. Behind them, the riders reached the place where the marsh road split. Elias was not among the first group. He had sent men ahead, then followed after losing more time in argument. The dogs resisted the water. The horses hesitated at the soft ground. One handler insisted the fugitives had taken the firmer route. Another swore the scent had gone low. They argued because the land no longer obeyed them. That was not a miracle. It was knowledge. Miriam had known it. Sarah had remembered it. Ruth now used it. The chain between those women was not written in any record at Blackthorn, because records there were designed to protect ownership, not truth. But the route itself carried the testimony. A dead cypress, a flooded bend, a section of ground too soft for mounted men, a ridge of roots that could hold careful feet. These were not accidents. They were the quiet architecture of resistance. By noon, the fugitives reached a ruined charcoal pit beyond the marsh. Ruth ordered them down into the hollow. They could not continue in full light. They covered themselves with branches and damp cloth. Children were placed in the center. Liza slept for the first time, still holding the newborn. Jonah stayed awake. He watched the road through a slit in the brush until his eyes burned. Near the middle of the day, 2 riders passed within 50 yards. The horses moved slowly. One man cursed the heat. The other said Elias would hang the blame on the overseers if the runaways were not found. Their voices carried clearly enough for the hidden group to hear every word. Not once did either man say Sarah's name. That omission mattered. It meant Elias was not telling the whole truth to his own men. He could report escape. He could report theft. He could report negligence, but he could not easily report that the route had been performed in front of him at his own entertainment. Power protects itself first from ridicule. The riders moved on. No one in the hollow breathed loudly until the hoofbeats faded. Only then did Jonah whisper, "They don't know." Aunt Ruth answered, "They know enough to hurt whoever they find." That was the colder truth. Ignorance did not make them harmless. Men did not need understanding to do damage. They needed weapons, permission, and anger. Blackthorn had supplied all 3. They waited until dusk before moving again. By then, the search had widened and weakened. Pursuit that begins with certainty can be fierce. Pursuit that begins with humiliation grows careless. Elias's men had too many directions, too many assumptions, and too little daylight left. The fugitives reached the first safe contact after nightfall. It was not a grand station, not a church basement with candles, not a clean wagon waiting under stars. It was a collapsed smoke hut behind a free black farmer's abandoned winter field, marked by 3 stones under a cedar root. Miriam had known it years earlier. Ruth had not been certain it still existed. Samuel found the stones, 3 of them, half buried. Still there, inside the hut, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floor plank, were 2 blankets, a tin cup, dried beans, and a strip of cloth marked with knots. The knots did not form words. They formed intervals. How far to walk before turning, how many creek crossings before the next shelter, how many nights before the road became safer. Sarah's map had brought them to the first handoff. Miriam's network had not died. It had gone quiet. That realization moved through the group with more force than celebration could have. They were not stepping into emptiness. Others had prepared before them. Others had risked being forgotten so that one night, people they would never meet might keep moving. Aunt Ruth sat down for the first time and covered her face with both hands. No one disturbed her. It lasted only a few seconds. Then she stood again. "We leave before moonrise," she said. The next stretch took them away from Blackthorn's reach, not beyond danger, never that quickly, but beyond the plantation's immediate knowledge. The land became unfamiliar even to Ruth. The knotted cloth guided them where memory ended. Jonah carried it carefully. The boy who had once repeated Sarah's route now held Miriam's continuation in his hands. He understood the weight of that without anyone explaining it. Maps did not always look like paper. Sometimes they looked like knots, sometimes like scars on a fence, sometimes like a girl forced to run while powerful people laughed. Back at Blackthorn, Elias tried to restore the old order. That is what men like him often do after exposure. They rename failure. They punish the nearest bodies. They write reports that make themselves victims. They speak of stolen property because they cannot survive the moral vocabulary of stolen lives. By the second day, he had the race removed from conversation. Guests were told not to repeat details. Overseers were instructed to say the runaways had escaped after midnight through unknown assistance. The broken rail was repaired. The storage shed was burned. The creek path was patrolled. The old grave on the Pine Hill was ordered cleared, but erasure has limits. Too many people had watched. Too many had heard the sentence Sarah gave him. You watched. It followed Elias longer than the fugitives did. As for Sarah, the record becomes deliberately uncertain. Some said she was taken from the holding room before dawn on the third day and never returned to the quarters. Some said Aunt Ruth had arranged one more exchange, one more debt from Miriam's old network, and that Sarah left Blackthorn weeks later hidden under sacks in a supply cart. Some said she died there and left no grave anyone was allowed to mark. The truth was kept out of the documents, that was common, but absence is not always defeat. Sometimes it is the shape left behind when a system fails to capture the whole person. Years later, Jonah would tell the story as an old man to children who had never seen Blackthorn. He did not begin with Elias. He did not begin with the dogs. He did not begin with the guests under the white tents. He began with the root. Burned tree, dry creek, abandoned shed, old grave, northern fence. Third rail. Then he would ask the children to repeat it, not because they needed to escape that place. That place was gone by then, or sold, or renamed, or swallowed by the same soil it had exhausted. He made them repeat it because memory was the only grave Sarah could be given with certainty. He told them the race was never a race. It was a document written without paper, a testimony delivered in front of criminals who mistook it for entertainment. A lesson passed from Miriam to Sarah, from Sarah to Ruth, from Ruth to Jonah, from Jonah to children born free enough to ask why anyone had ever needed such a map. And when they asked what happened to the baby, Jonah would grow quiet. Then he would say, "She lived." That was all he needed to say. She lived past the ledger, past the count, past the night Elias Whitmore believed he owned every path out of Blackthorn. She lived because 27 people refused to leave her behind, and because one injured woman stayed in a locked room long enough for them to disappear. That was Sarah's victory, not clean, not complete, not without cost, but real. They had turned the plantation's own spectacle into its indictment. They had used the crowd as cover, the race as instruction, the fence as evidence, the marsh as shield, and memory as weapon. Elias wanted them to remember Sarah's shame. Instead, they remembered the way out. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more dark, untold stories of survival, resistance, and the hidden strategies that history tried to bury. And comment where you're watching from, your city, your state, or your country. Then tell me your theory. What do you think happened to Sarah after that night? Was she punished, rescued, erased from the records? Or did she leave one final map that no one at Blackthorn ever found? They remembered the race because Elias wanted them to remember her humiliation. But they remembered the map because Sarah wanted them to remember freedom.